Let me tell you a story tonight that's quiet in the telling, but loud in the chest, unfolding beneath the merciless sun and endless night of the Old West, where silence can be louder than gunfire and love can cost you everything. This is a country carved by hard choices and harder consequences. It started with one quiet, reckless act. A young Apache who found a lost white girl in the desert and carried her home when leaving her would have been safer for everyone. 12 years later, she returned to that same frontier town, and he was still there, standing at the edge of the street, looking at her like the 12 years had never passed. One glance, and the life she was supposed to live suddenly felt like someone else's. What do you do when the man who once saved you is the only one who can still break you? Stay close. This one doesn't let go. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in the heart of Silver Creek, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the cracked earth like a reluctant confession. Dust hung thick in the air, a choking veil that turned the morning sun into a smeared orange smear on the horizon. It was barely past dawn, but the Arizona heat already clawed at the skin, pulling sweat from pores and turning every breath into a labored rasp. Celine Vex gripped the leather strap of her traveling bag, her knuckles whitening against the worn hide as she stepped down onto the rutted street. Her skirts, once crisp linen from Boston's finest seamstresses, now clung to her legs like a second, unwelcome skin, dusted with the fine red grit of the desert. She straightened slowly, forcing her spine into the rigid line her adoptive mother had drilled into her, a lady's posture, unyielding as New England stone. But beneath it, her chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming like an old bruise. 12 years. 12 years since she'd last tasted this air, sharp with sage and sun-baked clay, since the world had narrowed to thirst and terror under an indifferent sky. She told herself it was just the journey, the endless rattle of wheels over barren miles. But the land remembered. It always did. The murmur of the town, low voices haggling over sacks of flour, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, fell silent, as if a hand had clamped over every mouth. Celine felt it before she saw it, the weight of eyes, dozens of them, pinning her in place. Not the warm curiosity of a new face in a small outpost, but something colder, edged with wariness, like settlers eyeing a coyote slinking too close to the corral. Women paused mid-stride, their aprons flour-dusted and faces etched by wind and want. Men leaned against weathered posts, thumbs hooked in belt loops, their gazes lingering a beat too long. She was the outsider here, the polished Eastern girl with her too fine boots and too soft hands, a reminder of the world beyond these dust-choked hills that had chewed up so many and spat out fewer. From the shadow of the general store's sagging porch, Bram Quill watched her, his broad frame filling the doorway like a barricade. His fingers twisted the frayed edge of a rag, knuckles cracking white, as if the cloth might snap under the pressure. Quill's eyes, narrow and unblinking, raked over her, not with hunger or disdain, but with the flat assessment of a man who'd seen too many strangers bring trouble on the wind. Silver Creek didn't welcome easy. It survived, and strangers were just another storm to weather. "Miss Vex." A voice cut through the hush, warm but tentative, like a hand extended over a chasm. Isolde Fenn approached from the direction of the schoolhouse, her plain calico dress faded to the color of canyon walls, her face a map of lines carved by sun and solitude. She extended a calloused hand, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Polite, yes, but laced with the exhaustion of a woman who'd buried hopes alongside husbands and sons. "I'm Mrs. Fenn, head of the school board. We've been expecting you. Welcome to Silver Creek. Celine took the hand, her own palm sliding against skin rough as sandpaper. The contact grounded her, a small anchor in the swirling dust. But it cost her. She summoned a smile. Practiced. Gracious. The one that had charmed Boston parlors and secured her this position far from the polished cages of the East. "Mrs. Fenn, it's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this." The words tasted like ash, a performance she'd rehearsed on the long ride from Tucson. But even as she spoke, her gaze betrayed her, drifting unbidden toward the jagged purple line of the mountains rising like silent sentinels at the town's edge. The Dragoon peaks, unyielding and vast, whispered memories she couldn't quite grasp. Heat like fire in her lungs, small hands clutching at rough buckskin, a voice murmuring in a tongue like wind through dry grass. Isolde's eyes followed hers, a flicker of something. Pity? Curiosity? Crossing her features before she masked it. The mountains do that to a body. Pull at you, like they got unfinished business. Come, let's get you settled before the heat turns biblical. She turned toward the schoolhouse, a squat adobe building with a bell tower that leaned like a drunk against the wind, its walls scarred by sandblasts and stray bullets from forgotten skirmishes. Celine nodded, forcing her feet to move, one deliberate step after another. Keep the mask on, she thought. The Boston girl, the teacher, the fiancé with a future mapped out in autumn leaves and respectable vows. Draven would be here soon enough, stepping off the next coach with his pressed suits and plans to civilize this backwater. Safety. Stability. That's what she'd come for, wasn't it? Not the ghosts stirring in her blood, not the pull of a land that had nearly claimed her as a child. But as they crossed the street, the dust settling in lazy eddies around her ankles, Celine lifted her chin to scan the faces again, searching, perhaps, for a kindness to anchor her. And there, at the frayed edge of town, where the boardwalks gave way to scrub and shadow, he stood. He was half hidden by the awning of a trading post, broad-shouldered and still as stone, his long black hair tied back with a strip of red cloth that caught the light like spilled blood. Buckskin pants hugged legs scarred by thorn and trail, a cotton shirt open at the throat to reveal skin bronzed and etched by sun and strife. An Apache, clear as the knife at his belt. Tall, unyielding, with eyes dark as canyon depths. He wasn't trading, wasn't begging. He simply was, a presence that made the air hum with unspoken challenge. Their gazes locked, time folded like cheap paper. Celine's breath snagged in her throat, her bag slipping an inch in her grip. 12 years, and yet, those eyes. Not the soft mercy of memory, but the same fathomless regard, holding storms she could never name. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He just up-looked. Recognition flickered in his face, raw and unguarded, a crack in the warrior's mask that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Then it was gone, shuttered behind the impassive line of his jaw. Celine tore her eyes away first, heat flooding her cheeks, not from the sun, but from the thunder of her pulse, loud enough to drown the creak of saddles and the distant low of cattle. Had he seen her? Truly seen? Or was it just another white face in a sea of them, a fleeting shadow on his horizon? Isolde's voice pulled her back, oblivious. The school's just up ahead. Modest, but it'll do for startin' minds right. But Celine barely heard, her steps faltering as a gust whipped through the street, carrying the sharp tang of sagebrush and sun-warmed earth, the scent of secrets unearthed. Caleth hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. He just stood there, a silhouette against the relentless blue sky, watching her disappear into the town's dusty embrace. And in that watching, the question hung, sharp as a spur. Did he remember the girl he'd pulled from the jaws of the desert? Or had time, like the wind, erased her from his world? The schoolhouse smelled of fresh lime wash and old pine, the kind of clean that never quite hid the dust beneath. Late afternoon light slanted through the single window in Celine's upstairs room, turning the bare floorboards gold and throwing long shadows across the narrow bed and the small table where she worked. She had spread her books in careful rows, McGuffey's readers, slates, a few worn volumes of poetry she'd carried all the way from Boston, arranging them the way a soldier might check his ammunition before a fight he didn't want. Her fingers trembled once, twice, as she aligned the edges. She told herself it was only fatigue from the journey. The door opened without a knock. Draven Locke stepped inside and shut it harder than necessary. The latch clicked like a hammer falling. He stood there a moment, filling the doorway, his tailored coat still impeccable despite the miles of desert road, his face flushed from heat or something darker. He removed his hat, set it on the peg with deliberate care, then looked at her. "You're settling in," he said. It wasn't a question. Celine straightened the last book, kept her back to him for one heartbeat longer than she should have. "Trying to. The children come tomorrow. I want everything ready." He crossed the room in 3 strides, boots leaving faint red prints on the floorboards. The air shifted with him. Leather, bay rum, the faint metallic tang of a man who carried a revolver even when he didn't need to. He stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his body against her spine. "People talk," he said quietly. "They always do in places like this. Word is you were here once before. A child, lost in the desert, they say. Nearly dead." Celine's hand paused on the cover of a primer. She felt the old scar on her palm, the one she'd earned clutching a rock until it bled, itch under her glove. "I was very young," she answered, keeping her voice even. "I don't remember much." A lie. Small, but it tasted sour, like copper on her tongue. She remembered the heat that had peeled her skin, the terror that had made her small body curl into itself, the sudden shadow of arms lifting her, strong and steady, a voice murmuring words she couldn't understand but somehow trusted. She remembered the smell of sage and horse sweat and safety. Draven's hand settled on her shoulder, firm, possessive. "Good. No need to dig up old ghosts. We're here to start fresh. You, me, a proper life. This town needs a teacher who knows her place." But she felt the pressure of his fingers increase, not enough to hurt, not yet, but enough to remind her who held the reins. Outside the window, the street was quieting for evening. A horse snorted somewhere, hooves clopping past on the hard-packed dirt. Celine's gaze flicked toward the glass. A rider moved along the far edge of town, tall, dark-haired, moving with the loose, deliberate grace of someone who knew exactly where every shadow fell. Her breath caught. Draven followed her line of sight. His grip tightened. "You see someone familiar out there?" "No," she said too quickly. The word came out thin. "Just watching the light change." He turned her then, not roughly, but with the certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His eyes searched hers. Sharp, unblinking, the same eyes that had once charmed her with promises of security and status. Now they felt like a trap closing. "You've been quiet since we arrived," he said. "Too quiet. If there's something on your mind, Celine, you'd best tell me. We don't keep secrets." Her pulse hammered against her ribs. She could tell him. She could open her mouth and let the truth spill out. The man at the edge of town. The memory that had never faded. The way her heart had lurched when their eyes met in the street. But the words stuck. Telling would mean unraveling everything. The engagement, the position she'd fought for, the fragile safety she'd convinced herself she wanted. Instead, she said, "I'm tired, Draven. That's all." He studied her another long moment, then nodded once, as if she'd passed some test she didn't know she was taking. His hand slid down her arm, closed around her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, not yet, but tight enough to make her feel the bones beneath her skin. "We'll be fine here," he said, voice low. "You won't need to remember anything you don't want to. We'll build something solid. You won't have to think about the past." Selene looked down at his fingers encircling her wrist. For the first time in the years she'd known him, she felt the weight of that grip as a chain instead of a promise. Slowly, deliberately, she twisted her hand free. Draven's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. The silence between them thickened, heavy as the heat outside. "I need to finish here," she said quietly. "I'll see you at supper." He exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled sound. Then he turned, retrieved his hat, and left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft finality. Selene stood motionless until she heard his boots descending the stairs. Only then did she let her shoulders drop. She crossed to the window on legs that felt unsteady, pushed the sash up a few inches. The evening breeze slipped inside, carrying dust and the faint scent of piñón smoke. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass. Below, at the base of the lone cottonwood that marked the boundary between town and wilderness, Calith stood. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't needed to. The distance between them was measured in years, not yards, yet his gaze found hers as surely as it had that morning. No gesture, no wave, just the steady, unblinking regard of a man who had once carried her through hell and set her down in safety. Selene's fingers curled against the sill. Her heart beat so hard she felt it in her throat. He didn't look away. Neither did she. The sun slipped lower, painting the mountains in blood and gold, and the long desert shadow of the cottonwood stretched toward her like a question she wasn't ready to answer. The general store smelled of tobacco, old leather, and the faint sour tang of vinegar from the pickle barrel near the door. Midday sun poured through the dusty windows in harsh, slanting bars, turning floating motes into sparks of gold and throwing the long counter into sharp relief. Selene stepped inside, the bell above the door jangling once, sharp and accusing. The sound died quickly, swallowed by the sudden hush that fell over the room like a dropped blanket. 3 men stood at the counter, 2 locals in sweat-stained shirts, the third Bram Quill himself behind the till. A woman in a faded sunbonnet paused with her hand on a sack of cornmeal. All of them turned, not with welcome, not even with curiosity, just the slow, deliberate swivel of heads that said she had been noticed, weighed, and filed away. Selene lifted her chin. She had come for chalk, slates, a few yards of muslin for the blackboard border, simple things to make the schoolhouse feel less like a cave. She walked to the far end of the counter, pretending not to feel the eyes tracking her every step. The floorboards creaked under her boots, each sound unnaturally loud in the silence. She was reaching for a small slate when the bell rang again. The door opened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a full 10 degrees. Calith stepped inside. He moved without hurry, boots soft on the boards, long black hair shifting across his shoulders like spilled ink. The red cloth tied around his head caught a stray beam of light and burned briefly crimson. He carried no rifle today, only the weight of his own presence, broad shoulders, scarred hands, eyes dark and unreadable. He stopped just inside the threshold, letting the door swing shut behind him with a soft thud. No one spoke. The 2 locals exchanged glances. The woman in the bonnet took a small step backward. Bram Quill's face hardened into something flat and cold, the lines around his mouth carving deeper. Celine's fingers froze on the slate. Her heart slammed against her ribs, once, twice, hard enough to hurt. She should look away. She should pretend he was just another customer, just another face in a town full of strangers. But her gaze lifted anyway, drawn like iron to lodestone. Their eyes met. For one heartbeat, the store vanished. The counter, the sacks, the stink of tobacco. There was only him, the same steady regard that had once looked down at a terrified child in the middle of nowhere, promising without words that the world would not end today. 12 years, and the memory rushed back so fast it stole her breath. Rough arms, sage-scented buckskin, a low voice murmuring something she couldn't understand, but felt like shelter. Calith's jaw tightened. Recognition flickered across his face, raw and unguarded, then shuttered again behind the mask of calm. Bram Quill spoke first, voice flat as hammered tin. "We don't serve your kind here. You know that." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of movement. The two men shifted their weight. The woman clutched her sack tighter. Someone muttered something low and ugly. Calith didn't flinch, didn't answer. He simply stood there, gaze still locked on Celine for 1 second longer than necessary, then moved toward the counter as though the refusal hadn't been spoken. Bram's hand slapped down on the wood. "I said we don't serve." Celine heard the words leave her mouth before she could stop them. "Then serve me." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife through canvas. Every head turned. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden weight of judgment settling on her shoulders like wet wool. Bram blinked, thrown off balance. "Miss Vex?" She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the counter. Her hands were steady now, though her pulse roared in her ears. "I need 4 slates, 2 boxes of chalk, and a bolt of plain muslin. If you're open for business, I'd like to pay for them. And if the store is open to me, it should be open to everyone who walks through that door." The silence stretched, brittle and dangerous. The woman in the bonnet made a small sound in her throat. One of the men coughed, looked away. Bram's eyes narrowed. "You're new here, miss. You don't understand how things work." "I understand enough," Celine said. Her voice stayed level, but inside she was shaking. Shaking with the knowledge that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. "I understand that a man came in to buy supplies, same as anyone else. And I understand that refusing him because of who he is makes this a very small town indeed." Another beat of silence. Then Bram exhaled through his nose, a harsh sound. He glanced at Calith, long, measuring, then back at Celine. Something flickered in his expression. Not respect, not surrender, but the grudging calculation of a man who knew the cost of a fight he might not win. "Fine," he muttered, "but make it quick." He turned to Calith. "What do you want?" Calith named his items, coffee, flour, tobacco, in a low voice that carried no trace of triumph or anger. He placed coins on the counter with careful precision. Bram bagged them without another word, movements stiff and resentful. When the transaction was done, Calith turned. He looked straight at Celine. "Thank you," he said, so quietly the words were almost lost in the creak of the floorboards. His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by years and weather, but the timbre was unmistakable. The same low timbre that had once told a frightened child she would not die alone in the desert. It rolled through her like distant thunder, raising gooseflesh on her arms. She couldn't speak, could only nod once, a small jerk of her head. Calith held her gaze another second, long enough for her to see the question burning behind the calm, long enough for her to feel the answer she didn't dare give. Then turned and walked out. The bell rang again, softer this time, almost regretful. The room exhaled. Celine paid for her own purchases with hands that trembled now that the moment had passed. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. She felt their stares like hot coals against her back as she gathered her parcels and stepped outside. The sun hit her like a slap. She stood on the porch a moment, blinking against the glare, clutching the bundle to her chest as though it could shield her from what she had just done. She looked back through the open door. Caliph had not gone far. He stood at the corner of the building, half in shadow, one hand resting lightly on the stock of the rifle slung across his back. He wasn't watching the street. He was watching her. No movement, no gesture, just that steady, unblinking regard. It said nothing aloud. It said everything. We are not finished. Celine's fingers tightened on the muslin until the paper crinkled. She turned away first, walking toward the schoolhouse with steps that felt too loud, too deliberate, as though the whole town could hear the frantic beating of her heart beneath her ribs. Behind her, the wind rose, stirring dust along the street, carrying the faint scent of sage and horse and something older, something unfinished. The schoolhouse had gone quiet after the last child left, the echo of small boots and laughter fading into the thick evening hush. Celine sat alone in the upstairs room, the single lamp turned low, its flame guttering in the draught that slipped under the window sash. The day's lessons still clung to her skin, chalk dust on her fingers, the faint smell of slate and small bodies scrubbed too roughly with lye soap. She had survived her first day teaching in Silver Creek. 23 children ranging from 6 to 14, their eyes wide with the wary curiosity of frontier young. She had smiled, corrected sums, read from the primer in a voice that never quite steadied. And all the while, the memory of the general store had sat like a stone in her chest. She moved to the window and pushed the sash higher. Night had fallen fast, the way it did out here. No lingering twilight, only the sudden drop into dark. The desert stretched black and endless beyond the town's ragged edge, broken only by the pale ribbon of the road and the deeper shadow of the mountains. A thin moon hung low, cold and indifferent, spilling silver across the sagebrush and the single cottonwood that stood sentinel at the edge of town. Celine rested her forehead against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back, pale, hollow-eyed, the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes. She had told herself all day that nothing had changed. She was still Celine Vex, the teacher from Boston, still promised to Draven Locke, still safe behind the thin walls of respectability. But the lie felt thinner with every hour. A soft creak came from the hallway, boots on the stairs, deliberate and measured. Her stomach clenched. The knock was polite, almost gentle. "Selina?" Draven's voice through the door, smooth as polished wood, but carrying that undercurrent she had learned to recognize, the note of possession masquerading as concern. She closed her eyes for a second, breathing in the dry scent of pine boards and lamp oil. Then she crossed the room on quiet feet and turned the key in the lock, but she did not open the door. "I'm here," she said. A pause. She could picture him on the other side, hat in hand, coat still buttoned despite the lingering heat, posture straight as a fence post. "May I come in? I wanted to see how your first day went." The words were kind. The tone was not. It was the tone of a man who expected the door to open, who expected obedience wrapped in gratitude. Celine leaned her palm against the wood. Her pulse thumped against her wrist. She thought of the general store, of Calith's quiet "thank you," of the way the room had turned on her, of the way she had spoken anyway. The memory burned, bright and dangerous. "I'm tired, Draven," she said. "It was a long day." Another pause, longer this time. "You sound distant." His voice dropped, intimate, coaxing. "Did something happen? Did you meet anyone unusual today?" The question hung between them like smoke. She could hear the suspicion beneath the concern, the way he was already building the frame of an accusation. Her throat tightened. She could open the door. She could smile, let him in, let him pull her close and murmur reassurances until the knot in her chest loosened. It would be easier, safer, for tonight at least. But the thought of his arms around her, of pretending for one more hour that she still wanted the life he offered, made her skin crawl. "No," she said. "No one unusual." The lie tasted bitter, heavier than the one she'd told in the store. She felt it settle in her lungs like dust. Draven exhaled, a short, frustrated sound. "You're sure? Folks talk. They say you spoke up for someone today, in Quill's place." She pressed her forehead harder against the door. "I spoke up for fairness, that's all." Silence again. Then softer. "Open the door, Celine. Let me see you." Her hand hovered over the key. For a moment she almost turned it. Almost. Instead she whispered, "Not tonight." The words felt like a crack opening in the earth beneath her feet. On the other side, she heard the faint creak of floorboards as he shifted his weight. "You're shutting me out." "I'm tired," she repeated. It wasn't a lie this time. Exhaustion weighed on her bones like wet canvas. Another beat, then his voice, cooler now. "Fine. Rest. We'll talk tomorrow." His boots retreated down the stairs, slow, deliberate, each step a reminder that he was not a man accustomed to refusal. Celine waited until the sound faded completely. Only then did she exhale, the breath shuddering out of her. She turned the key the rest of the way, locking the door. Not against him, but against the part of herself that still wanted to open it. She returned to the window. The moon had climbed higher, washing the cottonwood in pale light. And there, exactly where he had been that morning, half in shadow, half in silver, he stood. Kaylaeth. He had not moved closer. He had not needed to. The distance between them was measured in years and unspoken truths, yet his presence filled the night like smoke. No gesture, no call. Just the quiet fact of him, tall, motionless, watching the window where she stood. Celine's fingers curled against the sill. Her breath fogged the glass for a moment, then cleared. He did not look away. She did not either. The wind rose, stirring the sagebrush, carrying the faint, clean scent of desert night, and something older, something that smelled of survival, of mercy given when none was owed. Somewhere far off, a horse whinnied, low and restless. Celine pressed her palm flat to the glass. "He's still there?" she whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the lamplight, fragile and true. She did not know whether the tremor in her chest was fear or longing, or both. Outside, the cottonwood leaves rustled once, softly, as though the tree itself had drawn a breath. And in the dark beyond the town, another sound drifted on the wind, the slow, deliberate rhythm of hooves approaching from the east. The night air hit her like a slap when she slipped out the schoolhouse door, cool, dry, carrying the sharp bite of sage and the faint metallic taste of dust that never quite settled. Silver Creek had gone to sleep hours ago, The street lay empty under a thin, sickle moon, the boardwalks silvered and silent except for the occasional creak of cooling wood. Celine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the chill was as much inside her as out. She told herself she only needed air, only needed to walk off the restlessness that had been clawing at her ribs since Draven left. But her feet knew the truth. They carried her past the last dim glow of kerosene lamps, past the shuttered storefronts, straight toward the lone cottonwood at the ragged edge where town gave way to wilderness. She stopped beneath its branches. The tree was old, twisted, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze like secrets no one wanted to hear. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in pale, broken patches, painting the ground in shifting silver and black. Celine leaned her back against the rough bark, closed her eyes, and let the night press in. For the first time, since stepping off the stagecoach, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done today. Spoken up in Quill's store, locked Draven out, chosen silence over safety. Each small act had chipped away at the life she had so carefully constructed, and now the pieces lay scattered at her feet like broken crockery. She should go back. She should turn around, climb the stairs, crawl into the narrow bed, and pretend tomorrow would be ordinary. But the thought of lying there, staring at the ceiling while Draven's voice echoed in her head, "You won't need to remember anything," made her stomach turn. A soft sound reached her. Boots on dry earth, deliberate but quiet, the way a predator moves when it doesn't want to startle prey. Celine's eyes snapped open. Caliph stepped out of the darkness beyond the tree, stopping a careful 6 feet away. Moonlight caught the red cloth tied around his head and the faint scars on his knuckles. He carried no weapon she could see, but the stillness in his posture spoke of readiness all the same. He did not speak. He only looked at her, steady, unhurried, as though he had all night and nothing else mattered. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Every rule she had ever been taught screamed at her to run. A white woman alone at night with an Apache man, the scandal of it would ruin her before dawn. Yet her feet stayed rooted. She could feel the rough bark digging into her shoulder blades, grounding her, reminding her she was still here, still breathing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Finally he spoke, voice low, roughened by years and weather, but carrying the same timbre that had once calmed a terrified child in the middle of nowhere. "You still have the eyes of the sky," he said. "The little girl with golden hair and frightened eyes. You were lost. I carried you." The words landed soft, but they struck deep. Celine felt her throat close. She remembered. God, she remembered. The terror, the thirst, the sudden shadow of arms lifting her, the smell of buckskin and sage and safety. She had buried that memory under layers of Boston manners and respectable promises. But here it was, rising like a tide she could no longer hold back. "You never forgot," she whispered. It wasn't a question. No. A single word, quiet and certain. "I never forgot." She trembled, not from cold, but from the sudden, brutal honesty of it. He had carried her memory for 12 years the way she had carried his. And now they stood here. Two people who should never have met again, separated by everything the world said mattered, and bound by the one thing it could never erase. Celine took one small step forward, then another. The distance between them narrowed to arm's length. She could smell him now. Leather, horse, the faint smoke of pinyon fires, the clean, wild scent of a man who lived close to the land. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Caliph watched her come. He did not retreat. He did not reach. She stopped just short of touching him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. I shouldn't be here, she said, voice barely above a breath. No, he agreed. You shouldn't. The admission hung between them, plain and brutal. She knew what it cost him to say it, knew what it cost her to hear it. Every rule of her world, every promise she had made, every expectation Draven had placed on her shoulders, they all screamed that she should turn and run. Instead, she lifted her chin. But I am? Calith's gaze dropped to her face, tracing the line of her cheek, the faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised a hand. Calloused fingertips brushed her cheek, feather-light, tracing the path where tears had dried hours earlier without her realizing. Celine did not flinch, did not step back. His touch lingered only a second, warm, careful, almost reverent, before he withdrew his hand. The absence of it left her skin tingling. The wind rose suddenly, sharper now, whipping dust along the ground and rattling the cottonwood leaves overhead. It carried the scent of distant rain that would never fall, the faint musk of sage crushed underfoot, and something darker, danger, waiting just beyond the circle of moonlight. Celine looked up at him. Her voice was steady when she spoke, though her hands shook at her sides. I don't want to go back. Calith did not answer with words. He only held her gaze, long and searching, as though measuring the weight of what she had just admitted. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped once, sharp and lonely. The wind gusted again, stronger, tugging at her shawl and sending a shiver through her frame. Neither of them moved. But in the silence that followed, the question lay plain between them, unspoken and unanswerable. What happens now? The first pale light of dawn crept through the window sash, thin and gray, barely enough to push back the shadows in the small upstairs room. Celine had not slept. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still in the dress from yesterday, the muslin she had bought at Quill's store folded untouched on the chair. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers knotted together so tightly the knuckles showed white. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Calith under the cottonwood, his hand brushing her cheek, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said she still had the eyes of the sky. The memory burned behind her ribs, warm and dangerous, refusing to be buried. A sudden violent pounding on the door jolted her upright. "Celine! Open this door!" Draven's voice came through the wood like a hammer blow, raw, furious, stripped of the smooth veneer he usually wore. The knob rattled hard enough to make the frame shudder. She stood slowly, heart slamming against her breastbone. Her legs felt unsteady, as though the floorboards had turned to sand. She crossed the room on numb feet and turned the key, but she did not open the door all the way. She let it swing inward just enough for him to see her. Draven shoved it wider and stepped inside without waiting for permission. His face was flushed dark red, eyes glittering with something close to madness. His coat was rumpled, hat missing, evidence he had come straight from wherever the night's rumors had found him. The scent of whiskey and horse sweat came with him, sharp and sour. He slammed the door shut behind him. The sound echoed in the small space like a gunshot. "They're talking," he said, voice low and trembling with rage. "All over town. They say you spoke to that Apache in Quill's store yesterday, like he was a man worth defending. And then—" He took a step closer, crowding her back toward the bed. "They say you were seen outside last night, alone, at the edge of town, with him." Celine's throat closed. She could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him, could smell the stale breath of a man who had spent the night drinking and listening to poison. "I went for a walk," she said. The words came out thin, unconvincing even to her own ears. "A walk." He laughed once, a harsh, ugly sound. "At midnight, in the dark, with a savage standing under the cottonwood like he owned the place." He reached out and seized her wrist, hard. His fingers closed like iron. Pain flared up her arm, sharp and bright. "Tell me the truth," he hissed. "Did you meet him? Did you stand there in the dark with that animal?" Celine stared at his hand on her wrist. The skin was already reddening under his grip. She felt the first bloom of a bruise forming beneath his fingers. Small, but real. The pain sharpened her mind, cut through the fog of fear. She lifted her eyes to his. "Yes," she said quietly. "I met him, and I don't regret it." Then for one long second, Draven went still. His face drained of color, then flooded dark again. Something shifted in his eyes, shock giving way to something colder, uglier. "You don't regret it," he repeated, voice dangerously soft. "No." He released her wrist so suddenly she stumbled back a step. Then his hand flashed up, open, fast, deliberate. The slap cracked across her cheek like dry lightning. The force of it snapped her head to the side. Pain exploded white-hot across her face. She tasted blood where her lips split against her teeth. Her knees buckled. She caught herself against the bedpost, one hand flying to her cheek. The room tilted, then steadied. Draven stood frozen, breathing hard, staring at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else. For a heartbeat, something like horror flickered across his face, shock at what he had done, at how easily the mask had slipped. Then it vanished. His expression hardened into something flat and merciless. "You will regret it," he said, voice low and shaking. "You think you can throw away everything? Me, your name, your future, for some filthy—" The door burst open behind him. Caliph filled the frame. He had come without sound, without warning. Boots silent on the stairs, presence sudden and overwhelming. Moonlight still clung to his hair, but the light from the window caught the cold fury in his eyes. His right hand rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt, not drawn, but ready. The knuckles stood out white against the dark leather of the sheath. He did not speak. He did not need to. His gaze locked on Draven, flat, unblinking, promising things no words could match. The air in the room thickened, heavy with the scent of pine smoke from the stove downstairs and the metallic tang of blood on Celine's lip. Draven turned slowly. When he saw Caliph, the color drained from his face again. His hand, the one that had struck her, twitched at his side, hovering near the revolver on his hip. But he did not draw it. Not yet. Celine straightened, still holding her cheek. Pain throbbed in time with her heartbeat, but beneath it something else rose. Clear, cold certainty. There was no going back from this moment. Not for any of them. Caliph's eyes flicked to her, brief, searching, then returned to Draven. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Outside, the first rooster crowed, thin and far away. No one moved. The room was small enough that the sound of the slap still echoed off the walls, sharp and final, like the crack of a rifle in a narrow canyon. Celine sat hard on the floorboards, one hand pressed to her cheek, where fire bloomed under her palm. Blood welled at the corner of her mouth. She tasted copper, felt the warm trickle slide down her chin and drip onto the faded blue of her dress. The pain throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Hot, bright, undeniable. She stared at the grain of the wood beneath her, at the small dark spot her blood had already made, and felt something inside her shift, slow and irrevocable, like a river changing course after years of wearing at stone, Draven stood over her, chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. His hand, the one that had struck her, hung at his side, fingers still curled as though they didn't know what to do now that the motion was complete. For one long second his face showed something close to shock. Eyes wide, mouth slack, the flush of rage draining away into something paler, colder. Then the mask snapped back into place. He drew a breath, straightened his shoulders, and looked down at her as though she were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. "You won't leave me," he said. The words came out low, almost conversational, but the tremor beneath them betrayed him. "You think you can walk away from everything we planned? From me? I'll tell them what really happened. I'll tell every soul in this town that you were seduced, lured by that filthy Apache, that you're no longer fit to teach their children, that you've thrown away your decency for a savage." Outside the open window, the morning was waking. A woman's voice drifted up from the street, soft, curious, followed by another, sharper, answering. Whispers. Already. The town had ears everywhere, and gossip moved faster than dust on the wind. Celine tasted blood again. She wiped it with the back of her hand, smearing red across her knuckles. The motion hurt. Her cheek felt swollen, hot. But the pain anchored her. She looked up at Draven. Not with tears, not with pleading, just looked. He took a half step closer. "Get up," he said. "Get up and tell me you didn't mean it. Tell me you'll forget this nonsense. We can fix this. We can—" "No." The word came out quiet, but it landed between them like a dropped stone in deep water. Draven blinked. "What?" Celine pushed herself up slowly, using the bedpost for support. Her legs shook, but they held. She straightened to her full height, small compared to him, but unbowed. Blood still trickled from her lip. She let it. Let him see it. "The engagement is over," she said. Her voice was steady now, though every word cost her. "I don't belong to you. I never did." Draven stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. Then he laughed. Short, harsh, disbelieving. "You'll regret that," he said. "When the whole town turns its back on you. When no decent man will look at you again. When you're left with nothing but that animal and the dirt he crawls in." Celine did not answer. She only held his gaze, letting the silence do the work. The pain in her cheek pulsed with every heartbeat, a reminder that this was real, that the hand that had once offered her a ring had now marked her face. She felt the bruise forming beneath her skin, small, but it would darken, spread, become impossible to hide. The town would see it. They would know. Draven's mouth twisted. He opened it to speak again. And the door, still ajar from his violent entrance, swung wider. Calith stood in the frame. He had not moved from where he'd first appeared. His boots were planted on the threshold, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Moonlight had long since given way to dawn, but the cold fury in his eyes had not dimmed. They were fixed on Draven, flat, unblinking, the look of a man who had seen death come close often enough to recognize its scent. He did not step inside. He did not need to. His voice, when it came, was low and cold as winter stone. "Touch her again," he said, each word measured, deliberate, "and you won't get another chance to regret it." Draven jerked as though struck. The color that had returned to his face now drained away entirely. He looked from Calith to Celine, still standing, still bleeding, then back to the man in the doorway. His hand hovered near his revolver, fingers twitching. but he did not draw. Not yet, the room held its breath. Outside, the whispers from the street grew louder. A woman's voice rising in question, a man's low reply. Footsteps paused on the boardwalk below. Someone had heard the slap. Someone had heard the voices. The town was listening. Draven took one step back, then another. His eyes never left Calith's face. "You'll pay for this," he said, but the words lacked force now. Thin, hollow. "Both of you." He turned, shoved past Calith without touching him, and disappeared down the stairs. His boots struck the treads hard, fast, retreating. Silence rushed in behind him. Celine stood motionless, hand still pressed to her cheek. Blood had begun to dry at the corner of her mouth. She felt it crack when she swallowed. Calith remained in the doorway. He did not enter. He only watched her, searching, careful, as though afraid one wrong move might shatter what little remained between them. The first real light of morning slipped through the window, catching the dust motes in slow, golden swirls. Somewhere below, a door slammed. Voices rose again, sharper now, urgent. Celine lowered her hand. The bruise was already darkening, a purple shadow spreading beneath her skin. She met Calith's eyes. Neither spoke. But in the quiet that followed, the decision hung between them, unspoken and heavy. There was no going back. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge, yet Silver Creek already felt like a furnace waiting to ignite. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the cracked dirt street, carrying the sharp stink of horse manure and fresh coffee from the open doors of the boarding house. Celine stepped out of the schoolhouse, the small canvas satchel slung over her shoulder containing only what she could carry. A change of clothes, the few books she refused to leave behind, and the tiny bottle of arnica salve she had used on scraped knees and bruised shins during her first day teaching. Her cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. The bruise had darkened overnight into a deep purple stain that spread from her cheekbone almost to her jaw. She had not tried to hide it. No powder, no scarf. Let them see. Let them know. The split in her lip had crusted over, stinging when she spoke or breathed too deeply, but she walked with her head up, refusing to hunch or hurry. The street was not empty. Men leaned against porch posts, arms folded, watching her pass. Women paused in mid-step on the boardwalk, baskets of laundry or market goods forgotten in their hands. Eyes followed her, some wide with shock, others narrowed in judgment, a few simply blank with the practiced indifference of people who had seen too many lives unravel in this hard land. Whispers trailed her like smoke. Heard he hit her. With that Apache. No place for a woman like that in the schoolroom. Celine kept her gaze forward, fixed on the far end of the street where the town frayed into open scrub and the long shadow of the mountains. Each step cost her, not just the ache in her face, but the deeper burn of knowing these were the same people who had nodded politely when she arrived, who had shaken her hand and called her Miss Vex, with something close to hope. Now their stares stripped her bare. A figure stepped into her path. Isolde Fenn. The older woman's face was pale beneath the brim of her plain bonnet. Her hands twisted together in front of her apron, knuckles white. She did not look angry, only tired, deeply and permanently tired, the way a woman looked after burying too many children and too many illusions. "Celine," she said, voice low and unsteady, "please, just stop a moment." Celine halted. The satchel strap dug into her shoulder. She waited. Isolde glanced around, quick, furtive, then stepped closer. They're talking. All of them. About last night. About what happened in your room. And about him. She swallowed. The board's meeting this morning. They're saying you're no longer suitable. I don't want this child. I never wanted any of it. But I can't stop them. If you come back inside now, if you tell them it was a misunderstanding. Celine felt the words settle in her chest like lead. She could do it. She could walk back up those stairs, sit in the small parlor with the board members, lower her eyes, speak softly of regret and confusion. She could keep the job, the roof, the thin shield of respectability. Draven would forgive her. Eventually. He would take her back, bruised face and all, because she would have proven she knew her place. But the thought of returning to that room, of seeing Draven's smug relief, of pretending the handprint on her cheek had never happened, made bile rise in her throat. She looked past Isolde. Draven stood 50 feet away, near the corner of Quill's store. He was speaking to Bram and 3 other men, his back to her, gesturing sharply. Even from here she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward the schoolhouse, waiting, certain she would crumble. Celine met Isolde's eyes again. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "But I can't." Isolde's mouth trembled. She reached out, hesitated, then let her hand fall. "You'll have nothing," she whispered. "No home, no position, nothing." "I know." The older woman stepped aside. Celine walked on. The whispers followed her, louder now, a low hiss like wind through dry grass. Faces turned, fingers pointed. A man spat into the dust as she passed. She kept walking. Halfway down the street, small footsteps pounded behind her. "Miss Vex, wait!" Celine turned. Lyra Thorne, 8 years old, braids coming loose, eyes red and shining with tears, ran toward her, skirts hiked up. Bare feet kicking dust, the child stopped short, breathing hard, staring up at the bruise on Celine's face. "You're leaving?" Lyra's voice cracked. "Don't go. Please. You're the best teacher we ever had. You made stories come alive. You didn't yell when I couldn't read the big words. Please don't go." Celine's throat closed. She knelt slowly, knees pressing into the dirt, heedless of the watching eyes. She opened her arms. Lyra threw herself forward. Celine held her, tight, brief, fierce. The girl smelled of sun-warmed cotton and the faint sweetness of molasses from breakfast. Celine pressed her cheek to the top of Lyra's head, felt the small shoulders shake. "I have to," she whispered. "But you remember what I taught you, all right? Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Even when everyone else says you're wrong." Lyra nodded against her shoulder, sniffling. Celine kissed the crown of her head, then gently eased her back. She stood, brushed dust from her skirt with shaking hands, and looked down at the child one last time. "Be brave, Lyra." She turned and kept walking. The town ended abruptly, boardwalk giving way to open ground, sagebrush and scattered rocks stretching toward the mountains. At the far edge of the last building, beneath the same cottonwood that had stood witness the night before, Caliph waited. He held the reins of a sturdy bay horse, saddled and ready. His face was unreadable in the slanting light, but his eyes found hers and held. Celine stopped a few paces away. The wind stirred, lifting dust in small spirals between them. Caliph extended his hand, palm up, steady, offering rather than demanding. "Go with me," he said. Simple words. No promises. No grand declarations. Celine looked at his hand, looked at the town behind her, the faces still watching from porches and windows, the life she had almost chosen, the bruise that marked the end of it. She stepped forward. Her fingers closed around his. warm, calloused, sure. She did not hesitate. Caliph helped her up behind the saddle. She settled against his back, arms circling his waist, the solid heat of him steadying the tremor in her limbs. He clicked to the horse. They moved out at a walk, slow, deliberate, leaving Silver Creek behind. Behind them, the whispers rose again, sharper, angrier. Ahead, the mountains waited, silent, vast, unforgiving. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the sound of hoofbeats followed. The bay horse moved at a steady walk, hooves striking the hard-packed earth in a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the pounding of Celine's heart. She sat in front of Caliph, her back pressed to his chest, his arms bracketing her waist. Not tight, not possessive, but steady, as though he knew she might still shatter if the wind blew too hard. The saddle leather creaked beneath them. The horse's muscles shifted warm and powerful against her thighs. She clutched the small canvas satchel in her lap, the only thing she had taken from the schoolhouse, and felt the weight of it like an accusation. Books, a spare dress, the arnica salve, nothing else. Everything she had owned in Silver Creek, her dresses, her teaching primers, the fragile illusion of respectability, had been left behind in that upstairs room like shed skin. The town receded behind them, its rooftops shrinking into the haze of heat and dust. The last boardwalk gave way to open ground. Sagebrush, scattered rock, the long sweep of land rising toward the mountains. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the clean bite of pine and the faint mineral scent of stone warmed by the sun. Celine's cheek still burned. The bruise had swollen overnight, pulling tight every time she moved her jaw. She tasted blood again when she swallowed, but she did not touch the wound. Let it show. Let it scar if it wanted to. Caliph said nothing. He guided the horse with his knees, reins loose in one hand, the other resting lightly on her waist. She felt the rise and fall of his breathing against her back. Slow, even, a counterpoint to her own shallow gasps. She wanted to speak, to ask where they were going, what came next, but the words stuck in her throat. Every mile they put between themselves and Silver Creek felt like another bridge burning behind her. A shout cracked the stillness. "Stop! Stop right there!" Celine twisted in the saddle. Behind them, maybe a quarter-mile back, 3 riders had broken from the edge of town. Draven was in the lead, coat flapping open, face contorted with fury. He held a rifle across his saddle, barrel glinting in the morning light. 2 other men flanked him, rough-looking, armed, the kind who hired out for trouble. Their horses were lathered, pushed hard. "She's been kidnapped," Draven's voice carried across the open ground, raw and desperate. "That Apache took her. Stop them!" Celine's stomach dropped. She felt the jolt of fear sharp as a blade between her ribs. Draven was not lying. Not entirely. In the eyes of the town, in the eyes of the law, she was a white woman riding away with an Indian. That was enough. That was all it would take. Caliph did not look back. His arm tightened around her waist, just enough to steady her. "Hold on," he said, voice low against her ear. He touched his heels to the bay's flanks. The horse surged forward, breaking into a lope. Celine grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, the satchel pressed tight against her chest. The ground blurred beneath them, rock, sage, dust kicking up in a pale cloud. Wind tore at her hair, stung her eyes, whipped the bruise on her cheek until tears blurred her vision. She looked back once. Draven was gaining. He had raised the rifle, not aiming yet, but the threat was plain. The other 2 men fanned out, trying to cut them off. Celine's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She could turn back. She could shout for them to stop, could slide from the saddle and walk toward Draven with her hands raised. He would take her back, bruised, humiliated, but alive. The town might forgive her if she played the victim well enough. She could keep her name, her position, the thin safety of being known as Draven Locke's fiancée, instead of the woman who ran with an Apache. But the thought of his hands on her again, of that same grip that had left marks on her wrist, that had cracked across her face, made her stomach heave. She turned forward, faced the mountains. "I'm not going back," she whispered. The words were almost lost in the wind and the thunder of hooves. Calith heard. His arm tightened around her. Once, hard, protective. "Then your home is where I am," he said. He leaned low over the horse's neck and urged the bay faster. The animal stretched into a full gallop, muscles bunching beneath them, hooves pounding the earth like war drums. Celine clung to the saddle horn, to Calith, to the single certainty that had carried her this far. She had chosen. The ground grew rougher. Rocky outcrops, shallow washes, the first rise of foothills. The horse slowed to navigate, picking its way with careful steps. Celine's breath steadied, though her heart still hammered. She looked back again. Draven and his men were smaller now, dark shapes against the pale plain, but still coming. A sharp crack split the air. A rifle shot. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 20 yards to their left. Celine flinched. Calith did not. He guided the bay into a narrow slot between two towering rock faces. The walls rose steep and red, swallowing the light, muffling the sound of pursuit. The horse's hooves rang against stone. The air cooled instantly, smelling of damp rock and ancient dust. They passed deeper into the slot. The town, the shouts, the rifle fire faded behind a bend of stone. Celine looked ahead. Only mountains, jagged, vast, silent under the wide sky. Calith slowed the horse to a walk. His arm remained around her, steady, unyielding. Neither spoke. The slot opened into a hidden valley, green with grass fed by a thin spring, shadowed by high cliffs. The horse stopped. Calith eased his grip, letting her breathe. Celine stared at the empty trail behind them. No hoofbeats now. Only wind moving through the rocks, carrying the faint, fading echo of a single gunshot that had missed its mark. She rested her forehead against Calith's shoulder. Her voice came out small, raw. "I left everything." He did not answer right away. When he did, his words were quiet, certain. "You left what they told you to want." She closed her eyes. The bruise on her cheek pulsed with every heartbeat. The satchel in her lap felt heavier than it should. Behind them, somewhere beyond the slot, a distant shout rose once more, angry, frustrated, still coming. Calith touched his heels lightly to the bay. They moved deeper into the valley. The cliffs closed around them like arms. And somewhere far behind, the echo of pursuit lingered, a reminder that the world did not forgive easily. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge by the time they reached the hidden valley, leaving the sky bruised purple and gold. The bay horse picked its way down the last steep slope, hooves scraping against loose shale, sending small cascades of rock rattling into the shadows below. Celine clung to the saddle horn, every jolt pulling at the bruise on her cheek until fresh pain flared hot and bright. She was beyond exhaustion, legs numb from hours in the saddle, throat raw from dust and unspoken words, but she kept her spine straight, refusing to slump against Calith, even as his steady warmth at her back was the only thing keeping her upright. The valley opened before them like a secret kept too long. A narrow ribbon of green grass fed by a thin spring, cottonwoods clustered along its banks, wickiups scattered in a loose half-circle beneath the overhang of red rock cliffs. Smoke on thin and blue from 2 cook fires. The air carried the scent of burning piñón, roasted meat, and the clean mineral bite of the spring. Horses grazed in a small corral of brush and rope. Children paused in their play to stare. No one called out. No one waved. Caliph eased the bay to a halt near the largest wickiup. He dismounted first, then reached up for Celine. His hands were careful around her waist, steady, not lingering, helping her down without making it feel like charity. Her legs buckled the moment her boots touched ground. She caught herself against his arm, then stepped away quickly, cheeks burning beneath the bruise. A woman emerged from the nearest wickiup. She was perhaps 50, lean and straight-backed, her dark hair streaked with silver and braided tight against her scalp. Her dress was simple deerskin, decorated with a few quills and beads, but the way she carried herself made the garment seem regal. Zorin, Calith's mother, her eyes, sharp, unblinking, swept over Celine from head to foot. The torn hem of her dress, the dust caked on her boots, the swollen purple mark spreading across her cheek like spilled ink. Celine felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing pressing against her ribs. She was the outsider here. White skin, pale hair, the smell of Boston soap still clinging faintly beneath days of sweat and trail dust. Every rule of this place, every unspoken law, said she did not belong. A few younger men, warriors, lean and watchful, stopped what they were doing to stare. One crossed his arms. Another murmured something low to the man beside him. Celine caught the word again and again, soft but unmistakable. White woman. The phrase landed like small stones against her skin. Thorn, older, grizzled, Calith's uncle, stepped out from behind a wickiup and spoke quietly to Caliph in Apache. The words were too fast, too low for Celine to follow, but she heard the edge in them, the repeated syllable that meant white. Thorn's eyes flicked to her once, measuring, not cruel, then back to his nephew. No one smiled. No one offered water or food. They simply watched. Celine stood still, hands loose at her sides, letting them look. She could have spoken, could have tried a greeting, a thank you, some small gesture to soften the silence. But the words felt false in her mouth before they even formed. She would not beg for welcome. She would not pretend she had not brought danger to their door. Instead, she lowered her head, just a fraction, enough to show respect without submission, and waited. Zorin studied her another long moment. Then she stepped forward. Celine tensed. The older woman lifted a hand, slow, deliberate, and brushed 2 fingertips across the bruise on Celine's cheek. The touch was light, almost clinical, but it carried a weight Celine felt down to her bones. Zorin's eyes narrowed at the sight of the swelling, the split lip, the dried blood still crusted at the corner of Celine's mouth. She spoke. Short, quiet, in Apache. Caliph translated, voice low at Celine's shoulder. Who hurt you? Celine met Zorin's gaze. The older woman did not flinch from the truth in her face. The man I was promised to, Celine said. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by dust and tears she had not let fall. The one who thought he owned me. Zorin held her eyes a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, sharp, and let her hand drop. No words followed. No comfort. No judgment. Just the nod and the silence that came after. Celine felt the air leave her lungs in a slow, trembling breath. The sun slipped fully behind the cliffs. Shadows lengthened across the valley floor. Someone stirred the nearer cook fire. Sparks rose in a brief, bright spiral. Children were called inside wiki-ups. The young warriors drifted away, still watching from the corners of their eyes. Night settled. Celine sat alone by the smallest fire, knees drawn up, shawl pulled tight against the creeping chill. The flames were low, fed only by dry twigs and a few chunks of piñón. They gave off little heat, but plenty of light, enough to paint her face in shifting gold and shadow, enough to show the bruise in all its darkening glory. She stared into the coals, seeing nothing. Hooves sounded in the distance. Not close, not yet, but unmistakable. The steady, purposeful rhythm of ridden horses moving along the trail they had taken hours earlier. Not their own. Not friendly. Celine lifted her head. Caliph rose from where he had been sitting near the largest wiki-up. He crossed the grass in long, unhurried strides, rifle already in his hand, not raised, but ready. He stopped beside her fire, eyes fixed on the dark slot in the cliffs where the trail entered the valley. The hoofbeats grew louder, still distant, but closing. Celine's fingers tightened on the edge of her shawl. The night air tasted colder now, sharper, carrying the faint metallic promise of trouble on the wind. Caliph did not look at her, but his free hand rested lightly on her shoulder, just once, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of it, before he stepped away toward the shadows. The fire popped. A log settled with a soft hiss, and the hoofbeats kept coming. The fire had burned down to a nest of red coals by the time Celine and Caliph moved away from the main camp. The valley held the night close, cool air sliding down the cliffs, carrying the scent of damp stone and the faint sweetness of grass bruised by hooves. They settled on a flat rock a little distance from the wiki-ups, far enough that the low voices and soft laughter of the others became only a murmur, like water over stones. The coals between them gave off no real warmth, but the light painted their faces in shifting copper and shadow, enough to see each other clearly without the intrusion of full flame. Celine sat with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, shawl pulled tight against the chill that had settled in her bones. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to a deep plum. It ached steadily now, a dull pulse that matched her heartbeat. She stared into the coals, watching small sparks drift upward and die before they could reach the stars. Caliph sat cross-legged beside her, elbows on his knees, hands loose and open. He had not spoken since they left the fire. The silence between them was not empty. It was careful, the kind of quiet two people make when they know one wrong word could break something fragile. Finally he spoke, voice low, rough from the trail dust still in his throat. "Draven went to Tucson," he said. "He told the soldiers you were taken, kidnapped. He wants them to come after us, to prove I'm the one who stole you." Celine's breath caught. She had known it was coming, had felt it in the way the hoofbeats had faded behind them earlier. But hearing it spoken made the threat real, solid, immediate. She lifted her eyes to his face. The firelight caught the scar above his left brow, the steady line of his jaw. "They'll come," she whispered. "Won't they?" He did not lie to her. "They will come." The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the spring, leaves hissing softly. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Low, mournful. Celine listened for other sounds, the snap of a twig, the jingle of a bridle, anything that might mean the riders had already found the slot in the cliffs. She heard nothing but the night itself. Yet the silence felt wrong. Too thin, too watchful. She looked down at her hands. They were still dusted with trail dirt. A small tear in the cuff of her sleeve showed pale skin beneath. She thought of the schoolhouse room she had left behind. The neat rows of slates, the smell of chalk and pine soap, the fragile safety she had traded for this. "I brought this here," she said quietly. "To all of you. If they come, if they burn this place, if they hurt anyone, it's because of me." Caleth turned his head. His eyes found hers in the dim light. "You did not bring the soldiers," he said. "They were always coming. We have lived with their shadow since before you were born. This," he gestured with his chin toward the Wickiups, the sleeping valley. "This is not new." Celine shook her head. "But this time it's different. This time it's my fault." He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, rough from years of rope and reins and stone. He did not squeeze. He simply held. "You don't carry it all," he said. "We have carried danger a long time. You are not the first to bring it through these rocks." She looked at their joined hands. His skin was darker than hers, scarred in places hers had never been. She felt the calluses against her knuckles, the steady pulse beneath his thumb. Something inside her cracked open. Not wide, not all at once, but enough to let the guilt breathe. "But this time," she said, voice barely above the crackle of the coals, "it's because of me." Caleth did not answer right away. He only tightened his grip, just enough to remind her he was there. The wind shifted, carrying a new sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The soft, rhythmic thud of hooves on stone. Not close, not yet, but coming. Celine's breath stopped. Caleth heard it too. His head turned toward the slot in the cliffs. He did not rise. Not yet. A young warrior burst from the shadows near the main fire, tall, lean, breathing hard. He spoke quickly in Apache, words sharp and urgent. Celine caught only fragments, names, directions, but the tone needed no translation. Caleth listened without interrupting. When the warrior finished, he nodded once. The young man glanced at Celine, brief, unreadable, then turned and disappeared back toward the Wickiups. Caleth looked at her. "Soldiers," he said quietly. "They've entered the mountains. Draven is with them." Celine felt the words land like stones in her stomach. She stared at the coals, watching a last small flame gutter and die. The bruise on her cheek throbbed harder, as though it knew what was coming. She lifted her eyes to Caleth's. There was no fear in his face, not the kind that showed. Only the same steady certainty she had seen under the cottonwood that first night. She opened her mouth to speak, to say she would go back, that she would meet them on the trail, that she would end this before it reached the valley. But the words would not come. Instead, she looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who had carried a child through the desert 12 years ago, who had stood in the doorway while Draven's handprint still burned on her skin, who had brought her here knowing exactly what it might cost. Her fingers tightened around his. "I'm staying," she said. The words were small, but they carried. Caleth held her gaze a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, slow, and rose to his feet. He picked up the rifle that had been leaning against the rock. The hoofbeats were louder now, still distant, but no longer a whisper. Celine stood too. Her legs felt unsteady, but she did not sway. Caleth stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the smoke on his shirt, the faint, clean scent of sage that clung to his hair. He did not speak. He only looked at her, long, searching, as though memorizing her face in case the night took something away. Then he turned toward the slot in the cliffs. Celine followed. The coals behind them glowed a last dull red, and in the dark beyond the valley's rim, the hoofbeats kept coming. The first light of dawn broke cold and thin over the ridge, painting the valley below in shades of gray and pale gold. Celine and Caliph stood on the narrow spine of rock that overlooked the hidden basin, the wind cutting through her shawl and tugging at the loose strands of hair around her bruised face. The air smelled of dew on stone and the faint, acrid bite of piñon smoke still clinging to their clothes from the night's fire. Far beneath them, the wickiups lay quiet, small, dark shapes against the green thread of the spring. No smoke rose yet. The people inside were waiting, watching. Celine's hands were clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms. The bruise on her cheek had settled into a deep, angry purple. It pulled tight every time she moved her jaw, a constant reminder of the hand that had put it there. She stared down at the approaching line of riders, 10 soldiers in faded blue, carbines slung across their saddles, horses stepping carefully over the rocky trail. Draven rode at the head, coat open, hat pushed back, his face turned toward the valley like a man who had already won. They stopped at the mouth of the slot canyon, perhaps half a mile out. The soldiers dismounted with practiced efficiency, unsaddling, staking horses, setting up a rough camp of canvas and picket lines. Draven stayed mounted. He rode in slow circles, pointing, first at the spring, then at the wickiups, then at the narrow trail that led down into the basin. His gestures were sharp, certain. He was giving directions, telling them exactly where to look. Celine felt the cold settle deeper in her chest, heavier than the mountain wind. If she did nothing, they would come. They would ride in with rifles ready, claiming authority, claiming justice. The people below, Zorin, Thorn, the children who had stared at her yesterday with wary eyes, would pay the price. Not because of war or old hatreds alone, but because she had run here, because she had chosen this place over the one that had marked her face. She could stay on this ridge. She could let Caliph and the others decide how to meet them. Fight, hide, scatter. It might buy time, it might save some, but the thought of watching from above while the valley burned, while the people who had taken her in without a word of welcome paid for her choice. It twisted something inside her until she could barely breathe. Caliph stood beside her, rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, barrel pointed down. He had not spoken since the warrior's warning last night. Now he watched the soldiers the way a hawk watches a snake. Still, patient, waiting for the first move. Celine drew a slow breath. The air tasted of dust and pine. "I have to go down there," she said. The words came out quiet, steady, though her voice shook at the edges. Caliph turned his head. His eyes found hers. Dark. Searching. "They'll take you," he said. "Or worse." "I know." He stepped closer. The wind lifted the edge of his shirt, revealing the scar along his ribs, old, pale against his skin. "If they harm you," he said, voice low and flat, "I will not let them live." Celine reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscle tensed beneath her fingers. Hard, warm, alive. "Don't," she said. "Not yet. Let me try first. For all of us." Caliph looked down at her hand on his sleeve. For a moment he did not move. Then he covered her fingers with his own. Brief, firm pressure, before letting go. His eyes said what his voice did not. He would not let her walk into that camp alone for long. Celine stepped back. She smoothed her skirt, dust-caked, hem frayed, then turned toward the downslope. The trail was narrow, treacherous with loose rock and thorn. She started down, one careful step at a time, boots sliding on shale, hands out for balance. The wind pushed at her back, as though urging her on, or warning her to turn. Below, the soldiers had finished their rough camp. A few stood guard, carbines in hand. Draven had dismounted now. He paced near the fire they had kindled, gesturing again toward the valley. When he looked up, when his eyes found her descending the slope, his face changed. The anger that had been there hardened into something colder, sharper. A slow, thin smile curled his lip. He raised a hand, not in greeting. The metallic snick of rifles being cocked echoed up the slope, sharp, deliberate, one after another. Celine kept walking. Her heart slammed against her ribs, loud enough she thought they must hear it below. The bruise on her cheek throbbed with every step. She felt the eyes of the valley on her back, the people in the wiki-ups watching from shadow, and the eyes of the soldiers ahead, waiting. She reached the flatter ground at the base of the slope. 50 yards separated her from the camp. Draven stepped forward, boots crunching gravel. The smile stayed on his face. Cold, victorious. Behind her, she knew Calith had moved to the ridge's edge. She did not look back. She did not need to. The wind rose again, whipping dust across the open ground between them. Draven's voice carried clear and hard. "You came back to the right side after all." Celine stopped. She lifted her chin, let him see the bruise in full daylight. "No," she said. "I came to tell the truth." The rifles stayed leveled. Draven's smile faltered, just for a second. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. And from the ridge above, the faint click of a rifle hammer being drawn back answered the ones below. The sun stood directly overhead, a white-hot coin pressed against the sky, turning the narrow trail into a furnace of glare and shadow. Celine walked alone down the last slope into the mouth of the valley, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust that hung in the still air before drifting away. The heat pressed against her skin, drawing sweat along her hairline and stinging the split in her lip. The bruise on her cheek had swollen further overnight. It felt hot and tight, pulling every time she blinked. She carried nothing, no satchel, no shawl, only the thin cotton dress, dust-caked and torn at the hem, and the truth she had come to speak. Behind her, high on the ridge, Calith followed at a distance. She did not look back, but she felt him. His presence like a steady pressure between her shoulder blades, hidden among the rocks, rifle in hand. He had not tried to stop her again. He had only watched her start down the trail, eyes dark and unreadable, before melting into the stone. The soldiers' camp lay ahead, 10 men in faded blue, horses picketed in a ragged line, a small fire sending up a thin thread of smoke. Carbines rested against shoulders or leaned against saddles, barrels glinting. The men stood in loose formation, watching her approach, some curious, some wary, none friendly. Their commander, a middle-aged man with graying sideburns and a face carved by too many desert patrols, waited at the center. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered revolver, thumb hooked over the grip. He looked tired, not cruel. Draven rode out to meet her. He had remounted when he saw her descending. His horse moved at a slow, deliberate walk, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on the stock of the rifle across his saddle. His face was flushed with heat, and something darker, triumph edged with fury. The smile that curled his lip was thin, satisfied. The smile of a man who believed the game was already won. He reined up 10 yards from her. "You came back," he said. His voice carried across the open ground, loud enough for the soldiers to hear. "Smart girl. I knew you'd see reason." Celine stopped. The distance between them felt both too close and impossibly wide. She lifted her chin, let him see the bruise in full daylight. The purple bloom spreading from cheekbone to jaw, the crusted blood at the corner of her mouth. "I came to speak to your commander," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, though her heart hammered so hard she felt it in her throat. "Not to you." Draven's smile tightened. He glanced toward the ridge, eyes narrowing as though he could see Calith hidden there. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Just tell them the truth. Tell them he took you. Tell them you want to come home." Celine looked past him to the commander. The man had stepped forward, hand still on his revolver, watching her with the careful attention of someone who had heard too many conflicting stories. She walked past Draven without another word. The soldiers parted slightly as she approached. She felt the weight of their eyes, the barrels of their carbines angled toward the ground, but ready. Each step across the open ground felt like crossing a frozen river. Thin ice beneath her boots, the possibility of breaking with every stride. She could be shot. She could be dragged away. She could be silenced before she spoke. She stopped in front of the commander. He studied her face. The bruise, the split lip, the steady eyes that refused to drop. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was gravelly, tired. "You're Celine Vex?" "Yes." He nodded toward Draven, who had dismounted and now stood a few paces behind her. "Mr. Locke here claims you were taken against your will, kidnapped by an Apache man. Says you need rescuing." Celine drew a slow breath. The air tasted of gun oil, horse sweat, and sun-baked canvas. "That's not true," she said. Her voice carried clear across the camp. "I was not kidnapped. I left of my own will. I went with Calith because I chose to." A murmur ran through the soldiers. Low, uneasy. Draven stepped forward. "She's lying. She's been—" Celine turned her head just enough to face him. "Draven struck me when I ended our engagement," she said. She lifted her hand slowly, pointed to the bruise. "This is the mark of his hand. This is what he does when he cannot control someone. I left because I would not live like that anymore." The commander's eyes flicked to the bruise, then back to her face. He studied her a long moment, searching for hysteria, for coercion, for anything that would make her words easier to dismiss. Draven's face darkened. "She's been brainwashed. That savage has twisted her mind." The commander raised a hand. "Enough." Silence fell, thick, heavy, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Celine stood motionless. She felt the sun burning the back of her neck, felt the eyes of every soldier on her, felt the ridge behind her where Calith waited. She had spoken the truth. There was no taking it back. The commander exhaled through his nose. He looked at Draven, long, measuring, then back at Celine. Draven's hand moved, fast, instinctive, drawing the revolver from his holster. He did not point it at Celine. He leveled it toward the ridge, toward the rocks where Calith hid. "You think I'll let him have her?" Draven's voice cracked with rage. "You think I'll just walk away?" The commander's hand dropped to his own revolver. "Mr. Locke!" A metallic click sounded from the ridge, sharp, unmistakable, the hammer of a rifle being cocked. Draven froze. The soldiers shifted, carbines rising. Celine did not move. The silence stretched, thin, brittle, ready to snap. The hawk cried again, high and distant. And in that suspended breath, the valley itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first shot that would break the world open. The moment hung suspended, brittle as glass under the noon sun. Draven's revolver was leveled toward the ridge, finger white on the trigger. The soldiers' carbines came up in a ragged chorus, metal clicking, barrels glinting. Celine stood in the open ground between them, dress clinging to her sweat-damp skin, the bruise on her cheek a dark flag in the merciless light. Dust drifted across the space like smoke from a dying fire. Draven's voice cracked the stillness. "You think I'll let him keep her?" He jerked the barrel upward and fired. A single, sharp report that echoed off the canyon walls. The bullet went high, harmless, meant only to frighten, but the sound ripped through the air like a whip. Horses shied. Men flinched. A horse snorted in panic. The commander's voice cut through the ringing aftermath. "Lower that weapon, now!" Two soldiers moved fast, bayonets fixed, shoulders squared. They closed on Draven from either side. He swung the revolver toward them, eyes wild, but the muzzle never found a target. One man caught his wrist, twisted hard. The revolver clattered to the dirt. The second pinned his arms behind his back. Iron cuffs snapped shut with a cold, final click. Draven struggled once, brief, furious, then went still. His chest heaved. His gaze locked on Celine. She did not flinch at the shot. She did not step back. She only watched as the soldiers forced him to his knees, as the commander stepped forward, face carved with the weary disgust of a man who had seen too many men lose themselves to pride. "Mr. Locke," the commander said, voice flat. "You are under arrest for discharging a firearm in the presence of federal troops and for filing a false report of kidnapping." Draven's laugh was short, bitter. "She's lying. She's quiet." The commander looked at Celine again. The bruise stood out stark against her pale skin. The split lip had reopened with the heat and strain, a thin line of fresh blood tracing her chin. "You say you left of your own free will," he said. "You say you choose to stay here." Celine met his eyes. Her voice came out clear, though it cost her everything to keep it steady. "I do. I choose to live here. No one is forcing me. No one ever did." The commander studied her another long moment, searching for cracks, for fear, for anything that would let him wash his hands of this. He found none. He exhaled through his nose. "You're of age. You're of sound mind. We don't interfere in a grown woman's choices." His voice dropped, tired. "Even bad ones." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We're done here." The soldiers moved, slow, mechanical, breaking camp, saddling horses, securing Draven's wrists to his saddle horn. He sat rigid, face pale with rage and humiliation, eyes never leaving Celine. She watched them prepare to leave, watched the cuffs bite into Draven's wrists, watched the soldiers glance at her, not with pity, not with contempt, just with the blank curiosity of men who had seen worse and would see worse again. She felt no triumph, no relief, only a vast, hollow quiet where something vital had once lived. When the last tent peg was pulled and the last horse saddled, Draven was led past her. He twisted in the saddle, straining against the cuffs. "You'll never be forgiven," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Not here. Not anywhere." Celine looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had promised her safety and given her a bruise instead. At the man who had thought possession was love. She said nothing. She turned her back. The commander gave the order. The column moved out, horses stepping slow over the rocky ground, dust rising in their wake. Draven rode at the rear, head high, eyes burning holes in her back until the trail bent and swallowed them. Celine stood alone in the empty space. The sun burned. The wind stirred dust around her ankles. She felt the weight of every eye from the ridge above. Caliths, the warriors, the people in the wiki-ups who had watched her walk into the guns. She started up the slope. Her legs were heavy, each step dragging. The bruise throbbed in time with her pulse. Sweat stung her eyes. She climbed without looking back, without pausing, until she reached the narrow ledge where Calith waited. He stood exactly where she had left him, rifle lowered now, barrel pointed at the ground. Dust clung to his shirt. A thin line of sweat traced his temple. He did not speak. He only extended his hand, palm up, steady. Celine looked at it. She looked at the valley below, the quiet wiki-ups, the spring glinting in the noon light, the people who had taken her in without a word of welcome. She looked at Calith, his steady eyes, the faint scar above his brow, the man who had carried her once and stood ready to die for her now. She reached out, her fingers closed around his, warm, rough, sure. He did not pull her close. He did not speak of victory. He only held her hand, and she held his. They stood in silence. The wind moved across the ridge, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and sage. Below, the last dust of the soldiers passing settled slowly. Above, a hawk turned lazy circles against the empty sky. Neither of them moved. But in the quiet between them, the truth lay plain. They had won, and yet nothing felt like winning. The fire had shrunk to a small nest of glowing coals, barely enough to push back the night. 5 years had passed since the soldiers rode out of the valley, and the Thung Lung had changed in small, stubborn ways. The wiki-ups were more numerous now, the corral larger, the spring still running clear. Celine's school had grown from a few curious children to nearly 30, Apache and mixed blood alike. Learning letters and numbers under the cottonwood shade, the community had survived. Not flourished. Survived. That was enough. Celine sat cross-legged on a blanket near the coals, her back against Calith's chest. Vesper, 4 now, slept across her lap, small dark head pillowed on her mother's thigh, one hand curled loosely around Celine's finger. Rune, 2 and restless even in sleep, lay sprawled against Calith's shoulder, cheek pressed to the buckskin of his shirt, breathing slow and even. The night air was cool, scented with pinyon smoke and the faint green of the spring-fed grass. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, a coyote yipped once, sharp and lonely, answered by another far off. Celine stared into the coals. The light caught the faint lines around her eyes, lines that had not been there 5 years ago, and the small scar on her lower lip where Draven's blow had split the skin. She no longer hid the mark. It had faded to a pale thread, but she felt it when she spoke, when she smiled, when she remembered. The valley had accepted her, not with open arms, not entirely, but with the grudging tolerance of people who had seen worse strangers and worse troubles. Some still called her the white woman behind her back. Not with hate, just with the truth. She would never be fully of this place. She had made peace with that. Mostly. Calith's arm lay loose around her shoulders, his free hand resting on Rune's small back. He had not changed much. Still lean, still quiet, the scar above his brow still pale against his skin. But the years had deepened the stillness in him. He carried the weight of the valley now, of the people who looked to him when decisions had to be made. He carried her too, without ever making it feel like a burden. The coals popped. A small spark drifted upward and died. Hooves sounded on the trail. Slow, careful. One horse. Celine lifted her head. Calith felt her tense. His hand stilled on Rune's back. A rider emerged from the slot in the cliffs, silhouetted against the starlight. Older woman, gray hair under a plain bonnet, riding side saddle on a tired bay. Isolde Fenn. She dismounted stiffly, tied the horse to a cottonwood, and walked toward the fire. The years had carved deeper lines in her face, but her eyes were the same. Steady, troubled, carrying the memory of a day she had not stopped. Celine did not rise. She only watched Isolde approach. Isolde stopped a respectful distance from the coals. "Celine," she said. The name came out soft, almost a question. Celine nodded once. Isolde reached into the pocket of her skirt and drew out a folded letter, edges worn from travel. "From Lyra Thorne," she said. "She's 14 now. She asked me to bring it, said you'd want to read it." Celine took the letter with steady hands. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was careful. Schoolgirl round. "Dear Miss Vex, you taught me to stand up for what's right, even when everyone says I'm wrong. I never forgot. I'm studying to be a teacher now. I want to help children the way you helped me. Thank you for showing me courage has a cost, but it's worth paying. Lyra." Celine's throat closed. She folded the letter again, pressed it to her chest. Isolde shifted her weight. "I was wrong," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. "That day. All of it. I should have stood with you. I didn't. I'm sorry." Celine looked up at her. The older woman's eyes were wet, shining in the firelight. Celine said nothing for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Small enough. Isolde exhaled, a sound that might have been relief or grief. She turned to go. "Take care of yourself," she said quietly. She walked back to her horse, mounted, and rode out of the valley without looking back. The coals settled with a soft hiss. Celine leaned her head against Calith's shoulder. Vesper stirred in her sleep, sighing once. Rune's small hand twitched against his father's shirt. Calith's voice came low, barely above the wind. "Do you regret it?" Celine stared into the dying fire. She thought of Boston parlors, of Draven's promises, of the schoolhouse room where she had once believed safety could be bought with obedience. She thought of the bruise that had faded, but never truly left. She thought of the nights she had woken gasping from dreams of running, of the valley that had become home, without ever fully welcoming her. "No," she said. A pause. "But I remember what I lost." Calith did not answer with words. His arm tightened around her, just enough to hold her close. She felt the steady beat of his heart against her back, the warmth of his breath in her hair. The coals glowed a last dull red. The wind moved through the valley, stirring the cottonwood leaves, carrying the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. They sat in silence. No victory march. No tidy ending. Only the quiet fact of survival, of two children sleeping in their arms, of a fire that still burned, of scars that would never disappear. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, the night stretched on, vast, indifferent, waiting for whatever came next. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening, and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.